Is it Molly or?
It's me. I'm recording.
Oh, hey,
Oh, you are
hey, Molly.
recording. Are you, Molly, are you also like letting people in the waiting room?
Yep, I will be in charge of that.
Well, welcome everyone to Balkan Circle. My name is Mary Newberger. I'm a professor of history here at UT Austin and also the director of our Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. I hear a little echo.
Yeah. Do you have your sound on, anybody?
Maybe I do.
Because you'll be talking foul.
Yes,
Okay, is
everyone
it
should
better?
have their sound off.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
My co-host is Kirill Abramov.
Thank you very much. My name is Kirill Abramov. Abramov, I was thinking. And I'm an assistant professor of political science at the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies, and I'm a proud co-host of the Circle, which has over 50 plus editions. And I'm pretty sure that people are watching the recordings on YouTube, which is a great resource for teaching and for people that are not able necessarily on Fridays to attend. But Mary, today we're having something which is really, really interesting, and this is, attested by just even the live presence here. We're having an exciting host, Tanja Petrovic, which I'll ask you to introduce, and an exciting new book. Looking very much forward to this Balkan Circle this Friday.
All right, me too. So I'll introduce our guest. Tanja Petrovic is a principal research associate at the Institute of Culture and Memory Studies, which is at the Research Center of the Slovenian Academy of Sciences and Arts in Ljubljana, Slovenia. She's the author and editor of several books and a number of articles and essays in the fields of anthropology, of post-socialism, memory studies, masculinity, gender history, heritage studies, linguistic anthropology, and labor history. Among her monographs are, and I'm going to give you the English title, although I think it is in BCMS, and the English title is Europa, Yugoslav Legacy and Politics of the Future in Post-Yugoslav Societies. She's also produced an edited volume called Mirroring Europe, Ideas of Europe in Europeanization in Balkan Societies, which is fantastic. And today she's going to be talking about her new book, which is amazing, entitled Utopia of the Uniform, Affective Afterlives of the Yugoslav People's Army, which is came out with Duke University Press this year. And she has a copy of it, and it has a beautiful cover.
It really exists.
All right, take it away, Tanja.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is it okay?
Are you muted?
I need
Mute yourself.
Okay.
No,
I'm sorry. I'm keeping
You
making.
can use one, not both.
Obviously.
Because it starts like a rock concert.
It's really.
Right? No, it starts like this.
It started a bit surreal. Let's see how it continues. Thank you, Mary and Kirill. Thank you for inviting me and having me here. It's great. I think it's 12 years since I was at UT, and I'm so thrilled to see some people I know and some people I still don't know, and some really old and good friends who were also companions of the making of this book from its early days. As you could see, I decided to name my talk simply putting the title of my book. And as you can see from it, it's kind of a combination of an unlikely combination of keywords, pretty current in anthropology and related disciplines right now. But their combination is still quite unlikely. That's kind of my that was my reason to do that, not only to go with the flow and speak on Afterlives and Utopia, everyone does it, but I combined with the uniform and the Yugoslav People's Army. I was very happy that Duke let me keep the real name, original name of this institution in the title of the book and not speak of a socialist army or something like that. which of course concretizes issues, but I don't think it's a story which is very local and only local, and I've tried to basically finish with that. So maybe I'll try to go basically through my talk. I will refer to these keywords from the title and try to combine them in a meaningful way, the way meaningful for me and the way in.
Oh, no, all good. I'm just being
you're-
very
oh, okay.
careful and taking notes.
Okay. So first, Utopia and Afterlives. Afterlives come inevitably together with the past. It's something. These are endings that are not ended. These are this is the faculty of the past to intervene in the present and maybe point to the future. So past is kind of an inevitable ingredient in this combination of utopia and afterlives. And as I already said, it's pretty widespread to think and write and talk about utopia these days, and of afterlives of the past, and that's basically comes as a symptom of our own present, in which, as Frederick Jameson put it, we see a marked diminution of production of new utopias. We are somehow living in the time where it's very difficult to think of the future in utopian terms. If we think of the future, it more comes as dystopia, more or less, for all possible reasons we are all very, very well aware of. And as a consequence, the future is kind of a term that saturates, sometimes even oversaturates today's humanities. And of course, a past increasingly becomes a place to look for an imagination of the future, since our present does not allow for that possibility. We very often turn to the past as a densely animated object of enchantment, as David Scott puts it in his own book. So here, of course, concepts like the future past by Reinhard Koselleck or Derrida's archive fever come to mind, and I play with them in my book a lot. And of course, this enchantment with the past, this kind of turning back to the Yugoslav socialist past, to knowledge and its archives, to knowledge for our own present and the future, happens there and in relation to that history as well. And there are many many topics that, I listed them here, which would be likely archives to explore possibilities for the future. My colleague Larisa Kurtovic wrote in History and Anthropology, it's now almost 5 years ago, 2019, an article titled An Archive to Build the Future, speaking about how in Bosnia people increasingly, in the time of overall crisis, which actually never ended since the war in the 90s, increasingly turn to the vocabulary, to patterns of commonality and collectivity from the socialist past in order to make an alternative to the present in which they are stuck. So anti-fascist struggle on the Second World War, anti-fascist front of women and its role in the liberation struggle, but also in emancipating women in socialist Yugoslavia, then self-management, the work of socialist companies and industry, both locally and abroad, in the context of the non-aligned movement, the non-aligned movement itself, amateurism, architecture, and so on, would be basically these domains which people would go back to look for the knowledge for the future. And just as an illustration, speaking of architecture, in 2001, the topic of Venice Biennale was how we will live together. And quite some post-Yugoslav countries actually there also reached to the architectural archives of the socialist past in an attempt to answer this question. Yugoslav People's Army, however, is a very unlikely place to go back and look for the archives for the future, and I'm very aware of that, but I will still in a way insist of it's not that simple, more or less. And the reasons why that can vary with great difficulties will be the place to look for inspiration is in the very nature of that experience and that institution. It was, of course, a total institution, an oppressive one, a mandatory institution, an institution young men had to enter without really having any free will about whether they want to do that or not. And it relied on discipline, drill, routines, strict hierarchy. Life serving the Yugoslav army meant that for 1 year or a year and a half, sometimes even 3 years, depending on the period, depending also on the where you served, like the Navy for the most was 3 years service. That was a very, very isolated experience, very detached from everyday life. Unlike maybe some other militaries or some other societies where this line is not that strict. For instance, my own husband served the Israeli army in the 90s because he escaped Serbia not to go to the army at the moment in 1991 when it was clear that he has a great chance to end up in the front line. And he would always say, yeah, it's not the same, you know, there you go home every weekend, you have your own underwear and you have warm water and good food. It was very different in the Yugoslav army, but I'll go back to that. Another reason comes why this particular experience is an unlikely candidate for the future imagination, and that one maybe interests me the most, it's the very forms in which it existed and was performed. And these forms were repetitive, very standardized, very predictable, very detached from the meanings life usually had. And here you have a critique of the Yugoslav People's Army by Marko Milivojevic, who at the moment he wrote it, was a researcher at Branford University. And he's kind of contrasting this National Liberation Army, partisan army of the Second World War in Yugoslavia, for which he says it was a revolutionary army with no ranks. Ranks were introduced very late, and it was kind of egalitarian, very intertwined with the citizens and so on. So this is kind of this romanticized idea about revolutionary army of the Second World War, Yugoslav anti-fascist movement. While the Yugoslav People's Army, he says, is basically very conventional. It's pretty made by military establishment to cater its own needs, and in a way, it is very, he says, maybe not here, but somewhere else, very detached from the people to which it needs to defend in a way. I mean, this, of course, we can argue that this is true certainly to some extent, but here we can also read something which is very present generally in revisiting the Yugoslav past, where there is this very strict line between idealized imagination of the sublime character of the anti-fascist struggle in the Second World War, and then everything that came later, maybe not immediately after, but everything that came in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, is seen as a long tradition, as actually something some researchers call post-capitalist state rather than socialist state, because of pretty much market economy, consumerism rising with years, and so on. In a way, and I very often critique that because and very often people say it like this period of socialism is ideologically tainted. It's bureaucratized, formalized, and people simply, as if those people who fought in the Second World War somehow disappeared and some new people emerged and became state bureaucrats. But I have here an archival text from the archives, from the notes of Konstantin Kocha-Popovic, who was legendary partisan commander of this legendary First Proletarian Division, very important for strategies. And at the same time, he was a very important member of the Surrealist Circle, lived in Paris, also fought on the Republican side in the Spanish Civil War. And he was actually a commander, and immediately after the war, he became a chief of the staff, Generalstab, so the most important man in the Yugoslav army, and he stayed there for several years. And from his notes, his war notes, not post-war, but war notes, we can see that actually he was very unsatisfied with this loose discipline and loose structures, and invested a lot of effort to kind of make partisan units more coherent, more synchronous in functioning, exactly by introducing these forms for which Yugoslav army is very often criticized as not really authentic or something that can give us anything for our own present. So he insists of collective and mandatory morning hygiene, routines, daily routines that these fighters need to adopt in order to function better as a collective. What I just outlined is of course not limited only to how Yugoslav army or other socialist armies, for that matter, would be perceived. It is part and parcel of a broader discourses which involved relationship between the form and evolution of socialism and its demise. And here we have this idea which became, of course, very much fixed and embraced after Alexei Yurchak's book, Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More, that with time, socialist forms were becoming more and more stale, more and more like far away from real meeting for what people could relate to in their own everyday lives. So in some moment, this gap became so large that socialism more or less imploded. And although everyone believed it's forever, no one was really pretty much surprised it was no more. So that's kind of an arc we can also find in internal Yugoslav discussions, where, as Branislav Dimitrijevic says in his book, it's a book in Serbian called Consumed Socialism, because he pretty much worked on consumerism as a symptom of this kind of early transition in Yugoslavia that started already in the 60s, according to him. So he says that utopian imagination was very early displaced by this ritualization, performativity, ironic attitude towards socialism, and so on. And of course, in these processes, that was certainly true for like many domains and in many situations. And these forms were also appropriated and reused for very different positionings, especially in art and activism. And we know this strategy under many names. So it's imitative exaggeration, subversive affirmation is Tjob. In case of Yurchak and late socialist Soviet Union, or Eigensinn in terms of Alf Lütke. So basically, also here we see that it's not simple. It's not that people just distant from their socialist life, mocked it, and at some point simply rejected it. None of these authors actually suggest it, and Yurchak in a very fine way shows how these forms, this ritualized form, had a capacity actually to produce very complex subjectivities, local relations and meanings, and kind of opened a lot of space for creative interpretations. And in my book, I have also such very interesting examples by authors serving the Yugoslav army, what they do, how they actually made use of these very limited forms they had on their own disposal to do something meaningful for themselves. Actually, before I go to affect, Yurchak also writes about parades as one of this big May parade, November parade in Soviet Union. So these really very large-scale collective rituals that were enabling formation of affective collectivities. And in this formation, these ritualized forms that are also very central for my own study here had very important roles. So a formula written on postcards, symbols people displayed were used as tool for affective connecting and exchange. So this here I'm already in the field of affect and emotion in relation to these limited ritualized forms. But in case of parades in Soviet Russia, Soviet Union, there are two characteristics that I find important. The first is that authoritative state was not really interested in this production of affect. It was kind of a byproduct of these huge rituals, not something the state aimed to produce itself. And the other, of course, these affective collectivities were time-wise very limited. That was something very temporary in a way. Such approach and explanation that somehow remains within the paradigm of knowledge and interpretation framework suggests is that citizens had control. They could strategically use these forms to make either to make fun, to make some affective ties, to make new subjectivity. But there was this strategic moment and moment of control over the situation that allowed, at the first place, strategic use of these forms for their own ends. You will see that I'll try to go here beyond this knowledge interpretation framework, and I'm going to try to look to affective work of these forms and emotional fabric. They were productive in the context in the context of the army service in the Yugoslav army, where subject position was not the one of distance and control, but people were locked in this isolated place all together. And maybe this is the moment where I should tell you that Yugoslav army really insisted on this extraterritorial principle, in the sense that they really put together radically different men and invested a lot of, probably financially, logistically. They really had to invest a lot into making these men functioning as units, as collectivities. But that was a part of politics they would never give up. That was totally clear, and that was like that until the very end. So within this kind of isolated space, having at disposal very limited forms, materialities, language, everything. These men embraced these forms as life because there was no other life for them. And I'm very interested in what came out from this embracement. And the other important difference maybe with if we compare the Yugoslav military service with parades and other emotion generating event that used ritualized forms, is that the authoritative power of the Yugoslav state was very interested in production of these effects. That was the mission. That was like the reason to invest a lot. Otherwise, they could, put together people speaking same or similar languages, people of similar education. They would have more efficient units, more easily functioning units. But that was not what they ever did. And generally, Yugoslav state was interested in effects of like affective ties that were ideologically framed usually as brotherhood and unity, bratstvo i jedinstvo, or comradeship, like drugarstvo. And these concepts were oriented towards building solidarities, solidarities and ties across ethnic, class, and gender divisions. That was very important. And as I already said, Yugoslav army was explicitly interested in the production of such effects. That's why it insisted on the territorial. You can give another one, circulate. Insisted on this extraterritorial principles. So men would usually go very far away, almost always to another republic, very usually to the place they otherwise never visited, and would spend this time in intimate proximity with men who very often would never meet, or kind of men they would never meet in their life. And that's something what they really recall as an important aspect of that experience. They usually say, only in the army I learned what kind of the country Yugoslavia was. Many would frame that and I think it's important to stress it, that it's not only that people coming from remote villages, living in very difficult circumstances, working hard, were saw something positive in the army, some kind of cosmopolitan experience. That would be one of the mainstream explanations, but also intellectuals, also people who went to serve the army when they turned 27, because studying certain fields such as mechanical engineering or medicine would allow you to go to the army only after you graduate, because the army considered useful the knowledge you will bring there. Even these people very often really appreciate the diversity they were exposed to, and say that there was no other place they could be exposed to that way, to the same kind of diversity. And this production of effects of friendship, care, solidarity, love, through ritualized forms, because these were forms that made a common ground for these men to be able to function together, to really live together. They needed these forms because the differences between them were very often very, very, very dramatic. That can be compared also, of course, to some other institutions, such as boarding school, for instance, where you also have this ritualized aesthetic as a very important element that makes people identify not only with the institution, but make comradeship and ties. And we know from the McDougall study of Tom School that these ties matter politically and socially very often later. And there is, of course, similarity with the Yugoslav army service, but there is this huge difference that while in boarding school, people are very carefully selected and come usually from similar background, class-wise and socially. Here we have really something opposite, great diversity of people brought together, where essentially these ritualized forms really serve as great equalizer. They really enable these people to function collectively. They also, of course, enable affects, enable friendships, and maybe the friendships are more important aspects of this affective archive I'm talking about in this book, because these friendships is actually what has afterlife. They are still present in very different modalities, but it's these friendships, I call them also in the book impossible friendships, because I was particularly interested in these friendships between men who are essentially radically different from each other. So they are not likely, candidates to make these male friendships in a way, but the situation in which they found themselves, we are still speaking of total institution, mutual help, mutual assistance. Sometimes someone with a degree would teach another guy to write, to read, to use typewriter. This other guy would protect this guy when they go out because he is physically much stronger. So like bases for solidarity were very different and mutual. It was not one directional interest. And these friendships, which would barely, and they would difficultly survive beyond the military service, still somehow very much matter to these men, and really have this capacity also to disrupt this giveness of the present. And they had very important meaning also because of the rupture that divides time between the army service and the present, and that these are Yugoslav wars in which these same men more or less were killing each other, or were together with the whole society is exposed to a lot of violence and destruction. So within the army bases, the repertoire of forms available to soldiers was very limited. But they made use of that repertoire, and it resulted in many things. It resulted in friendships, in affects. It resulted also in certain, artistic work. It resulted in the fact that many young men tried or experienced things they could not experience in their own places before they came to the army. I like this example of. I heard from my colleagues from Ljubljana who served in Podgorica, Titograd, former Titograd, the capital of Montenegro. He was a Slovenian, and he had this group of 4 best friends within the barracks. One was a lawyer from Sremska Mitrovica, another was another guy, and the third one was a peasant from central Serbia, from Šumadija, whose name was Dejan Simčić. And during these long afternoons, they decided to improvise a corner in some of the buildings, and they made a kind of a cultural corner, cultural club. They found somewhere disposed a photo of Ilvo Lariba and put it there, and then the soldiers would make their own texts, drawings. There were some cultural activities going on, which were pretty, bottom up, not imposed. And then Simčić wrote a poem which goes like in English, my house is like an island confined by a stream on the one side and a path of the other. Moja kuća je kao otok, which is interesting. He uses otok, which is kind of Croatian expression for ostrvo. S jedne strane je potok, s druge strane je put. Yeah. So what was also a result of this use of this ritual as form. They had also very important protective capacity. And we know from anthropological literature about this protective capacity of the ritual. In ritualized situations, the one who has control has an authority, but is also always aware of limits of that authority. And ritualized forms to the one who is subordinated give certain control. I have an example in my book from a movie called Border Post Karaula, made in early 2000s, where this director really very nicely shows this protective capacity of ritual. There is very abusive officer, and there is a guy, a Belgrade urban guy, who really wants, he's a big troublemaker. You never know what he really wants to do. So he comes to these officers and said, comrade, lieutenant, can I address you? And the guy says, what do you want? He don't want to keep with this ritualized, prescribed language use, but tries to break it because he really needs to know what this guy really thinks. But the guy never steps out. He says, I want to go on foot to Belgrade to pay a tribute to the biggest son of now nations and nationalities, Comrade Tito. And I said, are you fucking with me? He said, Lieutenant Commander, you did not understand me well. I would like to go to Belgrade, blah, blah. And it never ends. And of course, he is faking. He wants just to escape and eventually. But this is this protective capacity of the rituals that really comes handy in total situations such as this one. In the very discrete history of Yugoslavia and this disintegration in the late 80s, for many people, the uniform was protective as a shield because it protected them from attacks. That was particularly true for Albania serving in Serbia in the late 80s. I also have stories of some people in Croatia in the early 90s where there was the opposite situation. Even if you're Slovenian and a Croat and you're in the Yugoslav army uniform in Split, they will beat you. So it was kind of, there were two sides of the story, but I think it's this protective capacity is very important, and that protective capacity stretches also in the aftermath of the Yugoslav socialism and its army and military service. And it's maybe the best visible in this big archive of the photographs made in the army. One of the rituals was exactly that. You go to the army, first time you're allowed to go out to the nearby city, you go to the studio and make this photo and send it to your girlfriend, friends, relatives, parents. So everyone has these photos and they are still very much recognizable today. And of course, some men did that because that was kind of an unexpected behavior. Some did it because they were bored or wanted simply to make company to other friends, but they did not identify with the practice. But we cannot know anything about that looking at these photos today. They are all very standardized. And we also, with what is very important, cannot make any presumptions about these men. We cannot say whether they are, Serbs, Croats, Albanians, Slovenians, Muslims, Orthodox, Catholics. We cannot say whether they are highly educated or illiterate, whether they are coming from big cities or very remote villages. The most radical kind of visualization of this, where kind of the uniform comes totally to the front, are these. They are called the photos with memory, with this how you call it? Yeah. Usually, this kind of photos is associated with some kind of faking these fairs. Like where you place yourself and make a portrait of something you're really not. But this is not the case here. here we have kind of this ideological framing or family framing, like as a framework, and all these men are behind. These photos essentially signal, although they are, of course, we can read them as kitschy, as repetitive, as standardized. Actually, these are the photos which contain this spark of utopia I'm trying to talk about. And this utopia is of retrospective nature. It emerges only today when this possibility of being and acting outside ethnically defined frames is practically lost. And where we have political communities which still pretty much count on perpetuating tensions, ethnic tensions, as a way to stay in power. And I really think that this pointing to the importance of and the ability to recognize the others and be recognized on the like more universal moral principles of recognition is something we need to take seriously, as something which is really lost. That process of losing it, Mila Dragojevic describes it very well in her book called Immoral Communities, where she zooms certain communities, multi-ethnic communities in Croatia in the first half of the 90s, in the time of the war in Croatia, where from the kind of multi-ethnic communities where people could live together without really so much defining everything by ethnicity, all of a sudden who you are, whether you have a work or not, whether you need to live or stay, and everything else was defined only by that and nothing else. So that's why she speaks. There is no space anymore for any moral ground of life. And that's why these communities cannot be moral anymore. Even more poignant illustration for this is a movie of which I actually learned from Mary, made by Mitko Panov, who was, I believe, who spent some time in UT. It's a movie called Comrades, Yarani, made in 2001, where actually after he served in the army in Tito Veles after in 1981, and immediately after that he went to the US to pursue a career of an artist, and lived in the US for some time, and then later in Switzerland. And at some point he went back home to Macedonia, already an independent country, with the idea that he will trace his comrades from the army and see what happened with them. And it is like 96, so there are still barricades on the borders between Serbia, Croatia. The war in Kosovo and NATO bombing is still to happen. So this is really still a very kind of traumatic moment to do that. And since he was abroad, he was not exposed to this gradual learning that ethnicity really matters. He goes to a place, for instance, to some place to Bosnia, which is now Croat dominated, and asks for a guy with clearly Serbian name and gets arrested. And then people are very suspicious. He goes to Doboj, I think, and asks about Dino, and an elderly woman in this building where Dino is supposed to live, asks, was he a Muslim? And she says, I don't know. He was Dino. And she says, if he's a Muslim, he's certainly not in this city anymore. So that's like this ethnicizing logic, which really changed the life totally. And it is this aftermath from which the potential of this archive, very much standardized and repetitive, emerges actually as utopia, and as something people had and lost, and something that pointed to the future better than the ethnicized communities and societies in which they politically live today. I will go here just to also again tell you how this process worked. These are still photos from the Yugoslav army, made by a guy who became a professional photographer. His name is Jan Strauss, he's Slovenian. Jan was very active in this alternative scene of Slovenia in the 80s, and then forced to go to the army. He didn't take it well. And he suffered really badly there. So at some point, it was in Belgrade on the army base, he made this series of photos, and he calls them Yugoslav Army Soldiers 1, 2, and 3. And they are much more individualized, much more artsy, much more memorable than the photos I was showing you. But there is certain work here we need to be careful about. Jane himself says that these men are kind of, he chose them, and his idea was to make, to do something he already saw is going on, to do that with photograph, and that's to kind of attach ethnicity to people, also visually. According to him, this guy is to represent an Albanian. Does not mean the guy was really an Albanian at all. He is representing an Albanian. This one is a Serb, and this one is a Roma person from the region. And he also used the wildless camera to deform slightly their faces, so you can see that like they have kind of faces, probably they don't look like this in real life. And he also told me that he never showed these photos to these men, and he's pretty sure that they would not like these photos. But his idea was really to, and he anticipated pretty much back then in 87, 86, what happened later, that like typologization, classification is back, and it will become like life defining, like defining life and death. I won't go much into that because I see that my time is steadily running out. But it's exactly these friendships that existed during the army, and usually were discontinued. Many people simply, would have maybe some contact, many would not have any contact, are actually, they make this affective fabric that still kind of destabilize the giveness of the world in which many of the Yugoslav citizens or citizens at the former Yugoslav lands live today. But they are not the agency of these effects, and their afterlife does not manifest as presence or as faculty, but more in the opposite terms, as silence, hesitation. People usually don't know what happened with their friends, don't dare to ask. During my work, I very often was asked exactly that. Can you please check about this man? Not because these people were not able to do that themselves, but they didn't dare to do that. They didn't dare to learn whether these men are alive or dead, and even not less important, also what they became, whether they became nationalists, whether they don't want to hear about them. I have stories of this kind of ruptures made when the friendships were broken during the Yugoslav wars, where all of a sudden one of the friends did not want to hear about his friend anymore, only because he's a Croat. And they were never able to reestablish their connection. And for this Croatian guy, Božidar, for instance, that was and still is very traumatic. And he still speaks about his friend, but there is no possibility for this rupture to mend. This absent is combined with persistence, and in Mitko Panov's movie, an Albanian man whom he visited somewhere on the border between Kosovo and Macedonia, he asks many times, very persistently, what happened with Dragan? who unfortunately died somewhere in Republika Srpska. So this is something what really unsettles. They cannot make, come to terms with these friendships. These friendships are still alive, although they are not reconstructable. They're also, even if they are reconstructed in a way, they would rather confirm this aftermath. There is a huge, very populated Facebook group called Find Friends from the Former Yugoslav Army. It's hundreds of thousands of members, really, really a lot. And the main purpose of the group is to locate your friends from the army. Sometimes it's very painful because they learn that these men died during the war. Sometimes they manage to find someone and then they would post photos of the reunions. But what I really found important for me as these friendships which remain impossible, and the tensions they make, and also the way they really unsettle the present, or also do other things. One of the, for me, most important stories is my book. In my book is a story of my colleague Haris Halilovic, an anthropologist living now in Australia. I met Haris for the first time in Edmonton in Canada at a conference in 2010. I just started this project. I asked him whether he wanted to talk about his army service. He said, yes, sure. We went for a beer. He told me usual stuff. And he talked a lot about Đurica, his friend from the central Serbia, a peasant, very talented accordion player. Đurica was terribly afraid of darkness, and Haris graduated from medical high school, so he was working in a kind of, some kind of medical outreach clinic on the base. And he would put Đurica in quarantine and saying there is a suspicion of some contagious disease. And once officers go home, he would of course release them, but that was the way that Đurica never goes to night watch. He was terribly afraid of it. So that was their friendship, that was more of care and solidarity, taking care of each other. And then when the war started, Đurica and his parents called Haris and offered him to come to their village because there's the place, no one would look for him. He didn't do that. He ended up visiting his girlfriend in Prijedor, and then he was imprisoned, was in concentration camp. Also there he used the medical skills he acquired in school and then in the army. Eventually he got released, went to Zagreb and then to Australia, and he's there with his brother, but most of men from their family got killed in Srebrenica. And for him, this friendship with Đurica is kind of a thread connecting him with this space of former Yugoslavia in some acceptable terms, suggesting some humanity, because there are not many other reasons he would recognize humanity in that connection. And they are friends on Facebook. They wish everything best for their birthdays to each other. Sometimes exchange messages, but this tension between the importance of this tie and the impossibility to kind of, maintain it in a more meaningful way is also a way to, unsettle the present. So that's actually what really interested me in this book, how these fine, subtle, but persistent connections and emotions, how they unsettle the present in which we live. These photos of Janez Strauss suggest, in a way, a different genealogy of socialism and its demise than the one we are used to and with which I started. They usually suggest that it's not the forms that became meaningless, but the whole infrastructure that rendered this form meaningless got destroyed, and was very intentionally, very often destroyed. So this infrastructure enabled coordinates in which citizens, young men serving the army, their parents could act and believe that they have an agency which is kind of coordinating between them, their own desires, ambitions, the institutions, and the state. I remember myself, I was a teenager when some of my cousins went to serve the army. I remember very well that it was I was puzzled by that fact that someone can tell you, now you have to go somewhere for 1 year and more, and no one cares what you want, what you dream of, what's your plans. I found it really really strange also back then, but there was obviously something in that society that was acceptable. I'm not sure that we can buy a story that it was all oppression, because it's definitely like these stories say something different. And I'm finishing my book with an epilogue in which I'm starting from the moment of COVID. And that was the moment in which everyone remembered the response of the Yugoslav state, in which also the army had an important role. When in 1972, variola vera emerged in Yugoslavia, and there was a big danger of epidemic. There was also many people died, but the response was swift, very efficient. 18 million people got vaccinated in 3 weeks. And people were, of course, comparing it with COVID, not so much with their lack of trust in the institutions, because many people did not get vaccinated because simply they didn't believe to those who tried to vaccinate them. But also the main comparison was the inability of state to react, and to react in a way which would clearly be in the common interest. And that was also the moment where yet again, it's repeating all the time. Now we are again in this situation that these political elites of these countries were announcing a reintroduction of the military service. And it's an ongoing story. Always some of these guys promise by October we will bring it back, and they never luckily do that. Of course, there is certain support of that idea by the citizens, but that's I try to argue is not because people believe that they can bring back this infrastructure in which they would live in different coordinates, politically and socially, than they live today. I think they are very aware it's not impossible under the order in which we live now, but they rather point to what is absent, missing, and impossible within that order, and that's political community in which they could share values and visions of the future with the state itself. So this actually suggests a different relationship between the community between the individual, collective, and the state. And this text here hints to this different relationship. It's an invitation, like a nice card with golden lining. Parents would get after 1 month when this oath-giving ceremony was approaching. That was the first moment parents and relatives and girlfriends could visit the soldiers on the army bases. And so this sounds very paternalistic, could be a good argument to already fixed argument that the socialist state was very eager to control private lives of its citizens, but we can also read it differently. In the terms I just tried to suggest, that there were coordinates in which people simply saw themselves and their own agency in different terms. That's how this whole ceremony works. So I'll just finish with the self-management, the critique of ritualization. This extensive ritualization of the experience of army service goes hand in hand with the critique that the Yugoslav army was the opposite of the most important concept of Yugoslav socialism, and that was self-management. It was mandatory and forced. The freedoms of expression were totally limited. But again, if we read the definition of self-management from the Encyclopedia of Self-Management from the 70s, we see that they actually speak here not only on means of production and who owns them and who manages them. They speak of new social relations and social organization and conditions of interdependency, mutual social responsibility, and solidarity. And these are actually, these are points most of people I spoke who insist on that their army service was meaningless, and most of these people insist on that. These are points they would refer to as well. So I want to finish with maybe asking a question, what it has to do with us today, whether we can really learn anything from it. Whether Yugoslav army can be a place to look for recipes and protocols of how to make a better future. And I'm the last one who would romanticize mandatory army or any army in this world. And we all learned that also this army taught men to kill, and that they used this knowledge extensively at the first moment they had a chance to use it. And we are living in the moment in which, I mean, I won't talk much about it, but basically all armies teach to kill, and we can see that very, very easily today from different different places in the world. But still, can we still look at the socialist military differently from these fixed frames of, control, top-down, imposure, and so on, and acknowledge that that was a military that insisted on bringing together radically diverse people, that created an infrastructure in which they could live, be friends, and care for each other, unrestrained but confines of class, status, of ethnicity, and in which they could paint, take photographs, read books, even write haiku poems. Maybe that can help us not reconsider what this army can give us for our own future, but to think about the limits of our own horizons of the possible and imaginable in our own political present. Thank you.
And that was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Yeah, enjoyed it a lot, and I'm sure that our colleagues will have, or our auditorium as well, will have some questions. I certainly have a lot, as it, reminded me about some of my own experiences, which are, of course, not in this period, but since I've served, and I was looking at, all those rituals such as the oath, and the interaction and the great equalizer, and certainly the idea that you're meeting people that are very different, radically different from what you would meet in your social milieu, and some of the friendships, that I know from my family, my father and my uncles are the one that persist for years. The affectional people remember about, this was my unit, those 2 years, we spent this and that, lifetime bonds. In Bulgaria, of course, but a very different experience. And I think there was something about this, which I've noticed in the book as well, about the lasting military memories. The guys will trade long after they're in the army, right? Well, this is special time and experience. And even some trivial things, have like a different meaning, I suppose. So, at this point in time, I see that, Steven Siegel wants to open the floor, so please.
Yeah, I'll keep this question kind of brief. I was really struck in reading your book, and I want to take the time to read the whole thing, having read some of your essays in the past, by the sense of pan-Yugoslav unity. And it made me think not just of nostalgia and affect, but about the world after 1967, or the world, let's say, after 1968, after the Prague Spring, when there is mandatory conscription, right? I mean, there's mandatory conscription in Israel, men have to serve 32 months, women usually 2 years. But there was sort of the trend, of course, in the United States after the draft was no longer during the Vietnam years to kind of like almost make believe that moment was normal or normative. And what I say in this is within the JNA, there was from 69 to 92, if I remember correctly, all of those different units that were territorial defense units organized according to the republics. And then like there was this very serious almost census taking initiative of surveillance where they were trying to figure out who's Albanian, who's Serbian, who's Croatian, and so forth, right? And with the 74 Constitution, this was also really important, both the mechanism of sorting, trying to figure out who was a nationality, who was an ethnicity, and then in some ways trying to preserve that old unity, utopian, whatever you want to call it, this affect to avoid this almost like further nationalization and reduction. And so anyway, the quick question that I want to have for you is, in these communities that you study as an anthropologist, especially online, how much is forgotten about that particular state tactic of separating identities, right? Because there's the state unity, which is very important for any army service, bonding, you have both men and women, you have a high percentage of women in both anti-partisan units. Like how does the state kind of settle that, especially in the late 80s and 90s when you have past 91, the Geneva Accord, past 92, the formal dissolution of these territorial defense forces, which were like individual battalions, right? I mean, do people in the Facebook communities that you study as an anthropologist forget that they were separated, right, into particular regions or particular units?
Thank you, Steven. Yeah, I mean, probably they forget it more than they would because Yugoslavia is now equated with this, pan-Yugoslav, something seen as an alternative to national, to ethnic, and something hated a lot because of that and dismissed. Yeah. And not only because people are, nationalists per se, but because very often it's seen as these normative narratives of that prevail today in most of these countries see Yugoslavia as an episode that only made kind of damage to these national bodies and not anyhow contributed to anything. That's one of important constraints. I mean, I tried here to, of course, cover ethnically diverse, try to have ethnically diverse informants, but equally important for me was to have different people in class terms, educational terms where they live, how they went through these 90s. It's interesting, but territorial defense as a concept, as an experience too, because people were part of it, is not something very remarkable. But it's not something people would really kind of see as defining their subjectivity. It's not. It's different in Slovenia because these were kind of winning units, national heroes. But it's a different story. During Yugoslavia, these were kind of, there was a lot of insistence of cooperation between army units and territorial defense units. They had these actions of, enacting conflicts and so on. And of course, serving in reserve was pretty much related to territorial defense then. That was also the reason why it was much easier for to kind of that's the reason why many people ended up on the front lines, although maybe they wouldn't, because in their mind, I heard that from some of my relatives, that they answered the call, they were obliged to answer. They didn't realize in the first moment that this is another story. That's not a call of the reserve by the Yugoslav army that would protect Yugoslavia anymore. Yeah, so yeah, I don't really have a clear answer to your question, but it's definitely a different experience, also in terms of liminality, isolation. I write in my book that Yugoslav army service could be an utopian experience only because it was so heterotopian. It was so outside of everyday life. It put together people who would not naturally live together. It's
Social engineering.
Social engineering.
yeah, exactly. So it's sad thinking of that. The real Yugoslav ideas could only really be brought to life through the social engineering, but that's where we are. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. We have another question coming.
Thank you so much, Tanja. Lovely to see you. And I do remember when this all started, and I'm going to take you back there. But I think, and I just saw that you spent time at JNU in Delhi. So I mean that the whole issue of fracturing of a unity, which is part of South Asia as well, and the way that the sedimented nature of the afterlife, like even till my generation, I think our children will forget it. But I'm child of a family that had go through. And what I find fascinating is the larger question you're dealing with, that how does one live with difference, right? I mean, you take the example of the army, which is of course there and that you go to. But the idea is that how does a certain kind of a moment, with all its problems, that there was certain kind of a quote unquote, ethnic harmony or some sort was being constructed or whatever. And so that's sort of the political question you're asking, like, how does one sort of continue without annihilating each other, and and that's sort of the South Asian question as well. And so, but I'm not. That's a diff. We can talk more, and so what I thought was very interesting is the what the sort of the variety of activities that sort of become the foci for your argument of memory. And if I may be, my memory may be going. So you remind me, there were also, and it may be in the book, examples in your larger work in which people went to the countryside or long walks, and there was space, which sort of took people back now, even because there were certain memories with that space about shared experiences, right? And I thought that was, I mean, apart from all you shared, was very important in the way that the landscape was also shared, right? And the way people, even if they didn't personally reconnected with a certain past and certain memories of cordiality or comradeship through the land that they traversed in today's bifurcated Yugoslavia. And so I think that's where I think I thought the strength of your work is to really find those spaces which are not being talked about, whether they're landscape, whether they're jokes, whether there's art, that how does one start a certain kind of even a kernel of ways in which a dialogue can be happened, where certain kinds of amity rather than enmity can start. And I think that issue, it's not about peace and UN and this, and that kind of sort of structure, but how sort of the building bricks of living with difference. That's what I'm just sort of thinking aloud, and just remind me if I'm wrong in saying the idea of the walks in the space, and even the land itself lent itself, because these men would go to that and then had memories about that. I don't know if I'm making sense about it.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean,
so it's not about the army, it's about a large, I mean, I'm thinking about your political project, right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, as you know, post-socialist space and post-Yugoslav space even more because of the really violent conflict through which it disintegrated, are subject to very normative views. And it's very difficult for people to go outside. And one of the problems with reconciliation and other discourses, it's of course larger problem, and David Scott greatly writes about it. That's a global issue, not only particular Yugoslav or Eastern European, but this idea that you can exist and act and see other and maybe reconcile with other men, make friends only from the position of your own ethnicity is a kind of this straitjacket people need to get rid of in a way. And this is, it's again, our friend Nancy speaks exactly of this event after my straitjacket in post-colonial context, where it's very difficult to see and recognize and people and processes and everything what happens outside this kind of canal that goes from epistemologically from violent event to the aftermath. Everything before is seen as just as a prelude to violence. Everything after is seen just as a consequence or some kind of and that's limiting and that's politically crippling. And I think we need to try to go through all spaces where we can find alternatives to this. Cameron knows that I started with this project really many years ago, even before we met in Berlin in 2010. But I really struggled to find a perspective from which I can tell these stories. And not to objectify millions of men, that's not a good idea methodologically, but I also politically didn't want to start with this idea and discourses of masculinity, militarized masculinity, and knowing well what these people do because it's so easy to explain. And I also didn't want to, I wanted to talk about these millions of Yugoslav men which are somehow overlooked in most of what is being written about this conflict and its aftermath. Usually we speak either of these, very big nationalist heroes and new imagination, which is now very nationalistic, or it's opposite, like war activists, LGBT activists, peace activists, conscientious objectors in its movement. But somehow people who lived in this country becomes invisible, and their desires, their reality is somehow not something we reach for. So I wanted to do that. I wanted also to write about what they want to tell. I could also write about what they didn't tell, like the issue of homosexuality, to a certain extent also certainly the issue of violence would be very important here. But it's not what they want to tell, what they find important. It's not that I'm relativizing that, although I need to tell that I nevertheless think Yugoslav army was less violent as an institution than some other armies. After all this year, I think I can claim that without being accused for total romanticism. And it was really, really inclusive in a way I think it's difficult to find in some other armies. Bulgarian army was also a place where this common national identity was fostered and kind of built, but not all Bulgarian citizens were treated equally, at least not at all times. Like Muslim citizens were not usually given weapons. They were part of construction units. In Israel, Arab citizens essentially don't have to serve. Yugoslavia didn't discriminate by any criterion. And even that was kind of the worst thing someone would be accused of. So in that sense, I think there are differences, but I never try to say it was still a very oppressive institution. And men who insist of meaningfulness of that institution does not see military identity or as the best they can go back to, or they, of course, never want to go back. It's not the idea. But I think it's also important to look for these things in unlikely places. Yeah.
Actually, Sunny Rucker-Chan has a
Oh.
quick question, she
Uh-huh.
said. Sunny? Are you there? There you go.
Hi, Tanya. Thank you so much for a great presentation. I haven't had a chance to read the book yet. I hope to do that this summer. It's on my list. But as I was listening to your presentation, I was wondering about sort of cultural representations of the military in media. And you talked about Karaula, but of course, as you were talking, the first thing that came to mind was White and Black World, Crno-Bieli Svet, right? And so I was wondering, it seems to me that you're speaking about the military experience by as seen through those who actually served in the military. And I'm wondering what other ways the memories or maybe even the post-memory of military in Yugoslavia is sort of having an effect on or being presented within populations in former Yugoslav spaces.
Mhm. Thank you, Sunny. Yeah, that's of course a very important question and a question I'm addressing in the book. I mean, Karaula is not the first one. There was like the first post-Yugoslav film in a way was Outsider by Andrej Košak, Slovenian movie, which not so much about experience of army service, but it is about a family of a Yugoslav army officer. I think he was a Bosnian, lived in Slovenia at the moment when, in the 80s, when this alternative culture is bursting. It's a tragic family story about a boy who at the end commits suicide, but there we could see like that's one of the fixed images, the image of Yugoslav army officers as very conservative, very kind of attached to ideology, not being able to detach them from it, and very often being tragic persons from because of that. And that's essentially an image that became totally fixed also by another movie, which is called How the War Started Off My Island, which is about crazy Serbian officer who sacrifices these young men. And I try to also give up space. I cannot usually give a voice to them. Most of them are dead, but there were, of course, many officers who did everything they could to save these young men. Sometimes paid very, very high costs because of that. But it's also a very complex story. And what characterizes, I would say, this general popular post-Yugoslav culture is fixing this idea of the army as a very oppressive institution, Serb-dominated institution, and this is also a lens that prevailed and that I write in my book about flattening biographies, because very often, unfortunately, we are talking about the region where really anti-Communist violence happened, and very fortunately, after many, very often after many men, the only photos left are photos from the army. And there are some people who say, yes, that's the irony of history, because the same army, they are in the uniform of the army who killed them. And I think that's actually the flattening. These people don't have voice anymore, but they would probably not identify with that reading of their experience in JNA. Yeah. So it's that, yes, Crno-Bieli Svet is interesting because it's more into the register of these general stories about the army. People usually recognize a young man goes at the worst possible moment when he wants to party and have big dreams and big plans, and go to some place to do some totally meaningless routines day after day, and dress this uniform, which is the furthest possible of the self-image that guys has. And yes, of course, especially for young alternative people of the 80s, that was a big kind of rupture and big shock. But I also try to speak with these people and they nevertheless usually insist of the meaningfulness of that experience, and even more on its political, like they position it within the other coordinates of Yugoslav politics. They still insist are important, like non-alignment, self-management, like, and that bringing these young men together into the functioning collectivity. Yeah.
Maria had one.
And blood too. Yeah.
I was just, yeah, looking forward to reading the book. I'm currently writing I'm just impressed when people write books in general, as I'm struggling through my own. But I also have a chapter about standardized schooling in my book, so I'm really intrigued by all of the thinking you've already done. I was wondering, you had this quote from the general from the 1940s about the formation of the Yugoslav army. As this kind of explicit, like this is what we're trying to build. And I was wondering, these standardized procedures that you see as sort of ritualized, right? How much explicit talk was there about what they were trying to achieve with them? The thing with ritual, right, you could always say it was some sort of implicit, kind of affective, right, kind of associations with ritual as equalizing, but how much, meta discourse was there by both the organizers and the participants? I'm curious, sort of, did people feel that these rituals were there to equalize? Did they talk about them that way? And then also, you cited Yurchak and Kruglova and Lerman. Did people feel like they were effective? And did they believe that this equalizing was happening for the sake of something else? What was this something else? Was this Yugoslavia? Was it comradeship? Was it equality? Was it socialism? Or was it like friendship itself? Was it mutual aid? Was it this, like, in the Soviet context, the collective would be something for which you would sacrifice and be subjected to ritual? I guess, is there any kind of explicit sort of cues as to like what they pinned it to?
Yeah, thank you. That's very, very important question. I wouldn't say and I didn't find many explicit meta discourses of why we are doing this. The men themselves probably would not recognize it as while they were doing this, it was more, I'm sure, seen in the registers of oppression, disciplining, being put in a situation and forced to do meaningless operations all over again, exerting authority by officers and so on. So it's more the outcomes that I don't know, maybe could happen also differently, but with same affective potential.
What about the leadership, or like the kind of the people in charge of the military project? I don't know if you found any kind of big like army is the great equalizer, explain this investment in this cross-ethnic.
Yeah, they explain it, but what they say about that goes more fits more into general discourses in Yugoslavia, where there's so much talk about this dialectics between unity and diversity. They won't say we want to make all these men same, because you don't say it. They all men are very different. And truth to be told and to be fair, that army essentially really did not ignore diversity. I write a lot about this institution within the army, which was called soldiers artists. So those soldiers who came or who wanted to study art or already studied, who were artists, after 6 months of military training, they would get art studios to do their stuff. And there were whole infrastructure of galleries, central gallery in Belgrade. Every year that they have exhibitions. So it's kind of not really military work being done there. And I think the army also, because it insisted so much on this extraterritorialism and bringing so different men together, that army also pretty much counted on diversity and on the fact that there will be men who will teach other men to read and write. There will be men who will serve as medical, so, and they really used it explicitly. And also in terms of national diversity, it's so much written about this kind of very complex idea of how you can reach unity exclusively by nurturing diversity, no other way. So that's,
I mean, that seems like very 1960s.
yeah.
Like, so it's like.
Yeah, but here,
socialist bloc.
yes, I mean, here in Yugoslavia, it was until the end.
Yeah.
Most of this
That's
was produced
lovely.
in the 70s.
It's romanticism, kind of. I don't know if you know that expression. I think
Yes,
Shakir
yeah,
works. That
yes,
seems very
yes.
socialist romantic. But I just, one quick point before Vlad. I think it's really interesting because you say that this possibility of acting outside of ethnically defined frames is lost. But to me, it seems like what's even sadder is that this possibility is not so much lost as it's no longer made distributed across class lines equally. The people at the cosmopolitan centers of Europe still have this possibility of acting across ethnic frames.
Absolutely.
And they're hoarding it and they're not offering it.
Absolutely. I mean, that's why I said also, responding to Cameron, for me, class relations are equally important. We easily get back to ethnic politics after Yugoslavia with, what was there with Albanians. Of course, it was not the same for Albanians in the army and Serbs and others, never. But I think class moment is so important there. And this, also most of people who critique the army as being opposite to self-management do that from clearly class position. And I think that's very important to acknowledge spaces that very total and oppressive institution opened for, through amateurism, through cultural activities, but also through some more subtle strategies, like, after in the second part of the army service, there is huge surplus of time. These men are essentially bored. They have afternoons, doing nothing. And then you have this mixture, this radical mixture and diversity. And then these people then start doing things they wouldn't do from their own class position, like writing poems, doing things together, going for a movie, and so on. So I think this work is, for me, really important, just as important as just being, and you're right, it's not only that, it's this possibility too. We always also say that privileged people, and here we speak both about criminals, war criminals, and intellectuals, they had this possibility all the time. War criminals, they had many passports, they could travel around. Intellectuals could very quickly reestablish their Yugoslav unity in a way of treating this space as a common. But somehow, and I write about that very much, very often, because I'm a big criticism of Yugo nostalgia, and I always try to remind people that your critique is coming from a class position, saying that these people, what they do is banal and politically futile. Thank you. It's an important point.
Well, we're out of time. I know there's more questions, but if people want to stay, they can. But please, for people who need to go, it's totally fine. Please read the book. It's fantastic. Utopia of the Unicorn.
Thank you. This is our penultimate meeting for the semester, and we're looking forward to see all of you on our next Button Circle, which will be the last for this semester. But I'd like to thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me here.
This fantastic talk. Thank you.